During World War II, the top pilots, the elite of their time, were the aces from each nation. These aces, pilots who had downed 5 or more enemy planes, gained fame through their incredible feats in air combat. By the war's conclusion, only 3% of all fighter pilots had earned the title of ace. That small group was responsible for nearly 50% of all air-to-air victories between 1939 and 1945. What set them apart? An ace was undoubtedly exceptional, blending remarkable flying ability with bravery, sharp vision, and smart tactics. Those who survived their combat encounters were often the most calculated of all. These men skillfully balanced risk-taking with a calm, professional grasp of both their aircraft and their enemy's capabilities. The top aces chose their tactics by considering these two factors, along with the position they were in at the start of the engagement. Fighter tactics during World War II went through a significant transformation by the time VE Day ended the fighting. Despite these changes, the core elements remained unchanged. In fact, all the fundamental tactical principles had been established during World War I. However, it took time to relearn those lessons when Hitler's campaign in Europe began 2 decades later.
During World War I, air combat tactics evolved into 2 basic elements in the fighting over the Western Front. The first was the traditional swirling, turning dogfight that you see in all the World War I type air combat movies. But the Germans developed a real specialized tactic by 1918 to preserve their small fighter force on the Western Front. And this was the hit-and-run tactic. They were able to dive into opposing formations, hit them, and then run away as fast as they could by high-speed dives. Well, during the 1930s, both of these elements of air-to-air combat were really lost as tacticians and theorists concluded that dogfighting was a thing of the past because of the high speeds that new fighter aircraft were capable of achieving.
The RAF was likely the most influenced by that line of thinking. Instead of prioritizing air-to-air combat between fighters, it devised a range of strict tactics aimed at concentrating the firepower of fighter formations on bombers. RAF fighters were viewed as interceptors, not tools for air superiority.
The mass attack tactics developed by the RAF during the interwar period proved to be an utter catastrophe during the initial stages of the Second World War. The main reason for this was the fact that when flying in these tight formations, only the squadron leader or the flight leader would actually be looking around for enemy aircraft. Everybody else was so busy flying wing on the other aircraft in the formation that they didn't have the opportunity to be looking for enemy aircraft. Consequently, they were constantly surprised and aircraft were lost that probably wouldn't have been lost had they been flying in looser formations. The other issue was the fact that taking these unwieldy, large, cumbersome formations and trying to maneuver them in a very, very fast dogfighting environment proved to be incompatible with the realities of modern air warfare.
While the RAF entered the war with fixed, deliberate tactics, the Luftwaffe adopted the opposite strategy. Their experience in Spain led them to apply the method of World War I. They used loose formations of 4 planes, called a schwan, divided into 2 plane elements called rots. These flexible formations gave pilots space to scan for enemy aircraft. As the British adapted, they gradually shifted from their pre-war methods to modified German formations. Initially, RAF squadrons flew in 3-plane formations, known as VICs or Vs, with the leader positioned ahead and 2 wingmen tightly tucked behind. By early 1941, the British had adopted a 6-plane formation that was looser but flawed. It was a version of this formation that the RAF taught to newly formed American squadrons when they joined the fight against the German Luftwaffe in 1942.
Basically, the British formation that we used was a box formation. A leader, a wingman behind him and slightly off to the side, element leader, and his wingman off a little bit to the side, almost a box.
From the RAF tactics that the U.S. Army Air Force inherited in North Africa and also in the early days in England, the pilots, the fighter pilots, the American fighter pilots, developed a new formation that they called the Finger Four. And it's very similar to the German Schwarm. But imagine 4 planes on the end of each finger, and each fingertip or fingernail representing the aircraft. The leader would be right here, the flight leader. His wingman is this guy right here. The element leader is here, and the element leader's wingman is in trail behind the rest of the formation back here. And the point of this formation was to fly as loose as possible while still being able to provide mutual support. And this way they could all be looking around for enemy aircraft and protect each other at the same time.
As formation tactics evolved, so did the fighter pilot's understanding of how to best use his aircraft against the enemy. Before the war, dogfighting was largely viewed as a one-on-one contest, with little emphasis on teamwork within a fighter formation. Once again, it was the Germans who reconnected with their tactical roots. In Spain, they learned the differences between dogfighting styles, hit-and-run tactics versus turning engagements. A light, nimble fighter was ideal for a turning battle, while faster aircraft with superior climbing and diving abilities excelled in hit-and-run tactics.
The Germans developed the best early war hit-and-run fighter in the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 was capable of amazing vertical maneuvers and performance, and as a result they could dive down on British formations, hit them, make a pass, and climb away with their energy that they had accumulated in the dive, and engage and disengage the British at will, and the early American pilots as well. And this sort of attack caused a lot of losses amongst Allied aircraft and aircrew during the early days and early months of the war. The only thing that the British and the American pilots in 1940, 41, 42 could do was try to break away from these diving attacks and turn. And while that was a fine defensive maneuver, it made them entirely reactive. They could not really retain the initiative or capture the initiative away from this amazing energy fighter.
Anytime you got into a jam, attacked by 109, and they were usually above us, so they'd have the initiative initially. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. And if you could persuade him to stick with you, you could eventually get around, work into position on his tail.
The Germans could never turn with you. A 109 had a much heavier wing loading, 32 pounds versus the Spitfire's Hurricane's 25. So a German wouldn't be fool enough to try and get on a tight turn with you. You'd nail him. You'd just turn inside him and shoot him. They knew that.
Occasionally, overly eager German pilots made the fatal mistake of trying to turn fight against Allied aircraft, and those pilots did not survive long.
I spotted a bunch of 109s came down from above us, and heading down toward the targets. Well, I turned my flight up into them and tried to divert them, drive them off, which was kind of silly because there were about six or eight 109s and we were 4 P-40s at that point. At any rate, we got into a big hassle going round and round, and I wound up with 3 of them on my tail, taking turns making passes at me. And as I had mentioned earlier, when they'd get within what I estimated was firing range, why I'd go into a turn and manage to divert them that way to the point where they couldn't pull enough lead to hit me. And one of them made the mistake of trying to turn with me, and in 2 turns I got around behind him and killed him.
As the war progressed and newer American designs entered the fray over Europe, the Germans saw the advantages of the ME-109 and FW-190 diminish.
From about mid-1943 on, German pilot quality really began to decline. And as it declined, Allied pilot quality increased as there was more breathing room to train the pilots more effectively and more thoroughly before they went into combat. And it was that fact, combined with the new aircraft that the Allies were just beginning to deploy, that could outclass the 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, that gave the Allies the edge they needed in the skies over Europe.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was the first of this new wave. At high altitude, nothing could surpass a Thunderbolt when flown by an experienced pilot. While primarily known as a hit-and-run or energy fighter due to its excellent diving capabilities, skilled pilots could engage Luftwaffe fighters in any type of dogfight with the P-47D and M models. With such a versatile fighter, the tactical situation usually determined how the fight would unfold. Whoever had the altitude advantage typically initiated the fight, aiming to keep the engagement vertical, using hit-and-run tactics. At lower altitudes, enemy fighters were at a serious disadvantage. If caught low and slow, they were vulnerable to turn fights, with no way to escape. However, in skilled hands, the P-47 proved to be an exceptionally versatile fighter, even in low altitudes, turning engagements.
We were on the deck, working on the deck, and I think we could outfly him on the deck. He couldn't get away from me. I could turn in and keep right with him, and so I just had him going, and he finally decided it's better get out than to get shot down.
While the P-47 was highly effective, early P-38 pilots who faced the Luftwaffe in late 1942 and 1943 found themselves at a disadvantage. Initially, many P-38 squadrons made the costly mistake of attempting to turn fight with German 109s and 190s, often with disastrous results. Since the 109s and 190s were as fast or faster than early P-38s, American pilots often couldn't outrun their Luftwaffe adversaries, unless they began the fight with an altitude advantage. Even the mid-war P-38 variants, like the F and G models, struggled in Europe, particularly in the bomber escort role. When flying close to the bombers, Lightning pilots frequently found themselves in tactically unfavorable situations.
A German plane could cut off their attack any time. All they had to do was dive. A P-38, this was a bad maneuver, because if we went into a dive and followed them while we got into compressibility, at first we couldn't pull it out of there. Compressibility is a high-speed buffet, and it's dangerous. They were up there hiding in the sun, and they'd roll over and come down at us, and for a while there we thought the Germans were after us instead of the bombers. We couldn't outturn them, and we couldn't dive with them. It was their show there for quite a bit. We didn't get as many of them, I guess, as they got of us. We had quite a few losses.
After some hard-learned lessons, P-38 units managed to hold their road against the Luftwaffe through 1943.
When you see them coming, you turn. They didn't like the front end of a P-38, and they had respect for us. You see, they didn't know what we could do. They had to learn just like we did how well we were going to perform against them.
By late 1944, however, the P-38L entered service in the European theater, offering the Americans a game-changing version of the Lightning. With hydraulic boost controls, dive brakes to prevent compressibility, and more powerful Allison engines, the L model allowed pilots to use tactics previously unavailable to them.
The original P-38 was kind of stiff. You had to really put effort. 1 pound here was 1 pound out there. But after they put those hydraulic boosters on it, 1 pound here was 16 out there. And boy, we could outroll Spitfires or P-51s or any of the rest of them with aileron boosters. And so the quicker you can establish your turn and pull back on the stick means a tighter turn you can make, see? And we could outturn anybody, and then it would turn right, being so stable. Whenever a single engine plane gets down to about 91, 92 miles an hour, if you're turning to the right and it stalls, it'll flip back over this way, out of control. P-38, you could turn it right down forever at 72 miles an hour at full power and never stall out. And getting that turn established was the main thing. Up until we got the dive flaps, every time we get in a fight with the Germans at altitude, we could outturn them. We could really outturn them. But the minute we got inside of them, they'd just turn over and go straight for the ground, 26,000 feet or wherever you were, say. And if we chased them, we got out of control. And the P-38 wanted to tuck back under like that, and the more you pulled on it, the more it would tuck under. It was out of control. So we had to have something that would keep it from accelerating past that speed. So they invented this dive flap that was run by an electric motor, and it opened like that. It took about 1 second to open and close, you know. And the minute that guy in front of you pulled that split ass like that, you just pop those dive flaps and you just get right behind him. And boy, were they surprised after we got those, because they'd pull out at the bottom. 26,000 feet's not very fast to run, very far to run at 450 miles an hour, see. And when they pulled out at the bottom, there was a P-38 right on their tail, you know. And that was their big surprise. That really, dive flaps, we called them dive brakes, but they were dive flaps, that's what they were. They were really great. We could outturn them, we could outclimb them, we could outdive them, we could outlast them, and we could outgun them.
This late-war version of the P-38 gave American pilots the confidence to engage the Luftwaffe in almost any tactical scenario, knowing that, in a pinch, they could fight their way out. Jim Byers recalls one battle that began unusually, with the Americans engaging from below.
They were above us to start with. And we were in a hole in the overcast, you know, we looked up and there they were, about 2,500 feet above us. And they were getting all queued up in an echelon. So I just took my flight right through the middle of them. And they scattered. And then we started picking them off. But none of them would fly out of that hole, see. They had to be inexperienced. We shot all 14 of them down, 11 of us. But our 11 guys accounted for over 700 missions. See, they were pretty well experienced by then, you know, see. God, there ain't no sense of letting them get the first shot, you know. And if you sit and do nothing, you get hurt. But if you make a mistake, you can change that, see. If you do something and make a mistake, you can change it. But if you just sit there and do nothing, you can't change anything.
In other cases, the P-38 became one of the war's deadliest hit-and-run fighters, especially when it started a fight with an altitude advantage.
When we looked off to the east, a whole bunch of ME-109s, about 20 of them, were attacking 4 P-47s. Coming down, boy, just like rain down out of the sky. So we flew over there and got in the fight, and we shot down 8 of them. All that happens fast, you know. You're scared, but you're not panicked. You know, see, that's the difference right there. Yeah, and anybody that says they aren't scared, they're useless, because anybody that's any good at all gets scared.
In 1944, the introduction of the P-51B by the 354th Fighter Group in Northern Europe marked a decisive turning point in the war. Finally, the Allies had a long way to go air superiority fighter whose performance matched or surpassed that of any enemy aircraft. While the P-47's main weakness was its slow climb rate, the Mustang climbed like a homesick angel and could dive with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. With no major weaknesses, the P-51 became the top all-round air superiority fighter of the war, excelling at any altitude.
That caught the Germans flat-footed there for a while. They really gave them a bad time, because the 51s, he'd catch the German Air Force in the air, and they'd drop those tanks, and then they'd cut them to pieces, because the
the 51 could outturn the Messerschmitts. So they made out real well there.
By the war's end, the air battles had evolved into a fierce contest for positional advantage. In the early days, the Germans dominated the RAF with their sleek 109s and effective hit-and-run tactics. However, newer Allied aircraft arrived just in time to shift the dynamics of the air war. While still excelling in turnfights, Allied pilots gained unmatched flexibility with late-generation fighters, allowing them to engage the Germans in vertical hit-and-run combat and win. This versatility spelled the downfall of the Luftwaffe's fighter force by 1944. While various tactics could help mitigate an enemy's advantages in aircraft quality or quantity, some fundamental elements of air combat remained constant. Mastering these elements took time, which fighter pilots in World War II often lack.
During World War II, American pilots used to say, "Fly 5 and stay alive." And what that meant was, if you made 5 missions, if you flew 5 missions and you were still alive, your chances of survival through your entire tour just went up exponentially. The reason for this was something that later was called situational awareness. SA was basically the ability to process all the information going on around a pilot in the midst of an air-to-air engagement. And developing the sense of situational awareness needed for survival in air combat took time. If a pilot could fly 5 missions, he'd have the experience needed to really understand and process the things that he saw. But before that point, he had no concept of what was going on around him. Frequently, pilots never even saw aircraft around them in an air-to-air engagement, and even more seriously, they rarely saw the aircraft that shot them down. As a result, it was the inexperienced pilots that made up the brunt of losses through the entire Second World War.
Dogfights are funny things. They're huge. They might go all over the sky. You lose track of your own people. Hopefully your wingman stays with you. If he doesn't, then you're in trouble, because you not only have to watch what you're doing, you have to watch behind you. People who don't check 6 are in deep trouble. If they won't be victor, they'll be victim.
Identifying the enemy was the most crucial factor in winning any air-to-air engagement. Once the enemy had been spotted, maintaining visual contact was vital for securing victory. A common fighter pilot saying of the time was, "Lose sight, lose the fight." Without awareness of the enemy's next move, a fighter pilot couldn't choose the appropriate maneuver to counter it. This was a primary reason why many inexperienced pilots were lost. They simply couldn't see or process all the information unfolding around them. Sometimes, losing sight of friendly aircraft in his flight or squadron could be nearly as dangerous as encountering enemies in close-range turnfights.
One of my very first sightings of an enemy aircraft was a 109 who crossed in front of me. I turned and got headed towards him in a steep bank left, and all of a sudden he started coming apart, and I hadn't fired my guns yet, and it was Glenn Eagleston coming in from the other side had hit him. Glenn used to tell me all the time, "I owe you one." He says, we almost were air scoop to air scoop when he finally hit him.
If a fighter pilot managed to survive long enough to grasp some key lessons in air combat survival, he could become a highly valuable asset to his squadron.
During the war, to be a successful fighter pilot in air-to-air combat, you needed a couple of basic ingredients. The first was eyesight. A successful fighter pilot had good eyesight and could spot enemy aircraft at long ranges. The second was the ability to fly his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope. Basically, he needed to be a good pilot. And kind of as a corollary to that, he needed to understand his aircraft as thoroughly as possible so he could get the most out of it. And that really came down to a number of hours that that particular pilot had flown in the fighter type he was taking into combat. Lastly, he needed to have a thorough understanding of the tactics that would maximize his aircraft's potential and capabilities in air-to-air combat, while at the same time negating some of the advantages the enemy aircraft possessed over his own aircraft.
Air-to-air gunnery was, and still is, a true art form that only a select few ever master. Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, spent his initial months in combat unable to hit anything except from almost directly astern. After extensive gunnery training in the States, he returned to combat and became an exceptional aerial marksman, striking targets from nearly any angle.
Deflection shooting was the ability to take out a target from different angles relative to that particular target's direction. So firing from directly astern on an enemy plane was called a 0-degree deflection shot, while shooting from a 45-degree angle from behind was called a 45-degree deflection shot. The most difficult shot was the 90-degree deflection shot, where the shooting plane was perpendicular to the target aircraft. That required the most amount of lead and the most amount of calculations in the pilot's head to actually hit the target. Deflection shooting was actually an art form. It was very difficult to do, and there were very few pilots who were really good enough to hit a target from anywhere except dead astern. So those that were able to do it really had very high scores. René Fonck was probably one of the most famous deflection shooters in aviation history. He was a World War I French ace with over 70 kills to his credit. During World War II, some of the great deflection shooters were Hans-Joachim Marseille, who was a German pilot who was renowned for his ability to bring down very rugged aircraft like P-40s with 7 or 8 shots. He was that good of a marksman. For the Americans, probably one of the best deflection shooters was Tommy McGuire, who had 38 kills and was the second-ranking American ace in World War II.
For much of the war, Americans relied on fixed reflector gun sights. Initially, the standard K9 gun sight was utilized. However, later in the war, the United States developed a computer gun sight known as the K-14. With the aid of a gyro, the gun sight would calculate the necessary lead to hit an aerial target.
We had a K-14 sight that was a gyro sight, and you put the pip on the plane, and if you were in too tight of a turn, though, you better have your stationary sight on too. And that happened to me, and I was pulling in a real tight turn, and the thing was gone. Just dumped. It would dump. You pull a gyro too fast, it'll dump. Then you got to shut it off and get it going again. And if I'd had my needle or ring and dot, I probably got him, but nothing I could do. So you had to be careful when you're in a real tight turn with that gyro. But it was a big improvement.
It was indeed rare for an individual to master all these complex and demanding elements of air combat and survive long enough to excel at them. Of those who did, only a select few became true hunters. The aces. Their domain was the expansive skies over Europe. Their task involved the grim cycle of killing and survival. Losses among the top aces were consistently high.
Throughout aviation history, aces have always been among the most aggressive pilots in the air, but some have been more aggressive than others. And these types of aces led brilliant, if short, careers in air-to-air combat. They were the reckless of the reckless. They were the ones who would wade into any fight, no matter what the situation, no matter how heavily outnumbered, and they would fight it out. And these guys scored incredible victories in a very short span of time, but generally they fell victim to their own recklessness in the end and died at the hands of their own mistakes in air-to-air battle.
Surviving in air combat required courage, skill, and a fair amount of luck. To evolve into a hunter, rather than merely a target, necessitated a healthy mix of experience, sharp eyesight, and effective tactics. It took time for all participants in the air war to relearn the fundamental lessons of air combat that emerged from World War I. However, once they did, a multitude of tactical innovations reshaped the air war in Europe. Poor tactics could result in the downfall of even the most skilled pilots. Conversely, effective tactics could counter nearly any advantage the enemy possessed, ensuring both survival and success.
The P-51 Mustang, the most dominant escort fighter of World War II. It helped blaze a trail from England all the way to Berlin for America's bomber force.
Of course, the Mustang was a revelation. It was a war winner.
Its creation was sparked by a mixture of genius and chance. The Mustang and its two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin engine were the end result of years of technological development. From World War I to World War II, each generation of aircraft went ever higher and faster. But the Mustang's marriage with the Merlin might never have happened. National pride delayed the coupling of these two great innovations. But a new, deadly German adversary changed everything.
The Focke-Wulf 190, this was really a top-notch fighter aircraft.
With the FW-190 terrorizing the skies of Europe, the British and American forces swallowed their pride and joined together to create the ultimate fighting machine. December 17, 1903. The Wright brothers' aircraft, the Wright 1, successfully takes off, initiating the dawn of aviation. Man had already taken to the skies with gliders and balloons, but this was the first time that an engine had propelled him into the air. The Wright 1's engine was a crude design by today's standards and put out 12 horsepower only. It was an inline engine, meaning that its cylinders, 4 in total, were mounted in a straight line, a layout that would inspire some of the most advanced piston-engined aircraft ever created. Though a simple design, the Wright engine was innovative. It was the first engine to make use of a lightweight cast aluminum crankcase. Every pound counted. With a heavier engine, the Wrights may not have made history that winter's day in North Carolina. Aircraft weight and power would continue to be important to the evolution of flight. World War I was approaching, and the newly formed air forces of the world needed reliable engines with enough power to sustain flight during operations. From France would come a new type of power plant to take the fight into the air, the rotary engine. Rotary engines operated differently than the inline ones used by the Wright brothers. The cylinders were arranged in a radial pattern rather than a line. When the engine was fired up, the crankshaft remained stationary, while the crankcase and cylinders rotated around it. A rotary engine had one giant advantage over the inlines of the era. It was much lighter, and thus gave a pilot better performance during combat or while trying to evade an enemy. However, the rotary engine was not without its shortcomings. It had poor fuel economy, as it was often run on full throttle. It also provided an unpleasant ride. Castor oil was mixed with the fuel mixture for lubrication, with the side effect of heavy fumes, smoke, and an oil shower for pilots. Turns with a rotary-powered aircraft could prove treacherous. As the whole engine rotated, it produced a gyroscopic effect. A turn to the right, at full power and low level, could end with the death of a pilot. Rotary-powered aircraft remained part of Air Force inventories till war's end, but they were gradually supplanted by the inline engine. Inlines, based on the same principles as the one found in the original Wright plane, kept improving in terms of power and performance. Between the wars and across the Atlantic, a new type of aircraft engine would emerge to dominate American aviation. The U.S. Navy was looking for aircraft to populate its fledgling aircraft carriers. Space on board was extremely limited, but aircraft with inline engines often had lengthy noses. Their engines, built with rows of cylinders, took up too much space on cramped carriers. Rotary engines, though more compact, had too many other weaknesses to be serious contenders for the role. There was, however, a third type of engine. Before the war, there had been limited experimentation with radial engines. At first glance, these appeared to be just like rotary engines. It's only when they are fired up that the difference becomes clear. In a rotary engine, the crankcase and cylinders rotate around the crankshaft. But with a radial engine, the crankshaft rotates while the engine block is static. Radials often weren't as powerful as inline engines, but they were less complicated. They were cooled by air rushing over the engine rather than through a liquid cooling system. This made radials less vulnerable to battle damage, which might rupture the coolant lines. Navy pilots who might have to travel long distances over the ocean to get to a target needed an engine that would be sure to get them home under any circumstance. Most importantly for the Navy, radials were smaller than inline engines, so a greater number of aircraft equipped with them could be stored on board their carriers. The Wright Aeronautical Corporation, a successor to the original Wright Brothers Company, used their aviation expertise to create the first reliable radial engine for the Navy, the J-5 Whirlwind. The J-5 was put on display for the entire world to see when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in his Spirit of St. Louis in 1927. His flight solidified the reputation of the J-5 Radial as a dependable power plant. The budding airlines of the world were looking for engines to power their airliners and to bring their passengers across continents and eventually across the globe safely. Reliable radial engines seemed to be the ideal choice. Radials would power many of the principal airliners in the history of civil aviation, from the Ford Trimotor to the Boeing 247 to the Lockheed Model 10 Electra. Both the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army Air Corps would rely heavily on radial engines as they built up their inventories of fighters and other aircraft. In the 1930s, the U.S. had just one inline engine in development, the Allison V-1710, an engine that would one day power some of America's great fighters. At the time, relying on radials seemed a prudent decision, but in the years to come and in the battles ahead, it would leave the U.S. playing catch-up with their allies and enemies in Europe. In Europe in the 1930s, air forces and aircraft manufacturers were looking for speed above all else as they designed the next generation of fighters. Using streamlined designs and powerful V-12 inline engines, they pushed their aircraft to speeds over 350 miles per hour. Their inline engines were not only more powerful, they also helped to create more aerodynamic airframes. Their elongated shapes allowed for more streamlined designs as compared with radials. Inline engines may have been more vulnerable to attack due to their complex liquid cooling systems, but no matter how durable a radial engine is, speed kills in a dogfight. Inline engines were built to provide just that. It was from this European obsession with speed that some of the legendary fighters of World War II were born, including the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Beneath their elegant frames purred ever more powerful inline engines from Rolls-Royce and Daimler-Benz respectively. In the middle of 1940, the pilots of the RAF tested their mettle and the endurance of their fighting machines in some of the most spectacular air battles of World War II. Vice-Fuhrer Göring had promised to destroy the RAF and thus facilitate the invasion of Britain. Göring had at his disposal an armada of medium bombers protected by a deadly fighter force. The result of the Battle of Britain during those few vital months of 1940 is well known. There was a heavy toll in fighters and pilots on both sides. British and German engineers tried to squeeze every ounce of power from their engines. Any tiny advantage could be the difference between life and death. With Britain and her industry under direct attack, she looked to her old colony more than ever to provide her with desperately needed aircraft. Even before the Battle of Britain, the British Purchasing Commission had already been shopping for additional aircraft. The US's initial offer of fighters was not well suited for the high-altitude dogfights taking place over Europe. This was partially due to the American engines available. The US had concentrated on radial engine production instead of inline engines like the ones so popular in European fighters. They did have the Allison engine, the V1710. Like the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, it was a 12-cylinder inline engine, but it had a complex turbocharger often difficult to fit into an aircraft. To boost power in the thin air at high altitudes, the Allison engine used the heat of its exhaust to power a turbine, and thereby increase the airflow and power. One American aircraft, the Lockheed P-38, had the extra space needed to house the turbocharger. It was a big twin-engined aircraft to begin with, and had space in its tail booms for the extra equipment. But given the size of the P-38, it wouldn't have fared well against nimble single-engine German fighters in a dogfight. America had other smaller fighters powered by the Allison engine, the P-39 Airacobra and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. In both cases, their manufacturers failed to include Allison's turbocharger. The P-39 had an innovative layout, with its engine situated mid-fuselage, behind the pilot. It was designed to house both the Allison engine and the turbocharger. However, a scoop built into the left side of the fuselage to cool the turbocharger was deemed too aerodynamically expensive. Both the scoop and the turbocharger were eliminated from the production design. This change crippled the Aerocobra's ability to fight at high altitudes. In the case of the P-40 Warhawk, a rugged, single-engine airplane, the turbocharger was excluded from the design from the get-go. This limited its optimal altitude to just 15,000 feet, and thus relegated the aircraft to ground attack work. The British Purchasing Commission was still interested in the Warhawk, even with its limitations. They saw it as more of an Army support aircraft. However, the Curtiss factory was running at capacity and could not fulfill the order. With no suitable aircraft readily available for purchase, the Brits would turn to North American aircraft. The British Purchasing Commission proposed that North American build the Warhawk under license from Curtiss. But NAA President Dutch Kindleberger had a bolder plan. He guaranteed that he could create an even better airplane, using the same Allison engine, in less time than it would take for him to retool for Warhawk production. The Brits said yes, and the end result was an airplane that may well have changed the outcome of the Second World War in Europe. Back in Europe, Germany was looking for an aircraft to augment the Bf-109. In the Battle of Britain, the Bf-109 and Spitfire were closely matched. But the Bf-109 lacked the range to be highly effective in its escort role over Britain in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe had a twin-engined escort, the Bf-110. It had the range to be an excellent escort, but it lacked the maneuverability to defend itself or its charge in a dogfight. It also used two Daimler-Benz 605 engines, making it an expensive sitting duck for British interceptors. Looking for a quick solution to their escort dilemma, the Luftwaffe even considered having the 110s tow 109s into battle to conserve fuel. But in the long run, using two aircraft to perform the role of a single fighter was an even more wasteful solution. What the Luftwaffe needed was a dedicated single-engine aircraft to fill in for the Bf-109 on longer-range missions, and ideally something to give them a decided advantage over the British fighters of the time. However, the Luftwaffe wanted to have its cake and eat it too. They wanted a new fighter, but they didn't want to sacrifice any of the precious 605 engines meant for the Bf 109. To the consternation of the Luftwaffe, most of the new submissions for fighter designs from German industry were to be built around this very same engine. To solve Germany's escort woes, one man, Kurt Tank, Focke-Wulf's legendary designer and test pilot, did what was almost unthinkable at the time. Since the start of the war, British and German designers had relied upon powerful 12-cylinder inline engines to power their fighters. Tank dared to build Germany's next fighter around a bomber's radial engine. The air-cooled BMW 801 radial engine had plenty of power and had proven reliable in the Ju-88 and Do-217. But radials in a fighter were a rare sight in Europe. It was difficult to build as aerodynamic a fuselage to house them in as when constructing one for a slender inline engine. Though an unconventional design track, Tank saw two reasons for encouragement. Firstly, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the U.S. had already done research on improving airflow around radial engines. Over time, they had developed the NACA cowl, which at least helped to reduce drag. This was a simple ring which fitted snugly around the cylinders of a radial engine. It not only made the engine more aerodynamic, it also improved cooling. Secondly, Tank observed that the US and Japanese navies were employing several modern carrier aircraft, all with radial engines. Aircraft like the F-4F Hellcat and the Japanese A-6M Zero. The lightweight Zero had been almost unstoppable in the early part of the Pacific War. Tank had continued to explore ways of improving his new radial-engined aircraft and reducing the drag effect, although some say his greatest task was selling the radial idea to the ministry. If that was the case, the bureaucrats must have been quickly won over by Kurt Tank's first prototypes. Given the designation the Focke-Wulf 190, and unofficially known as the Butcher Bird, the Luftwaffe's latest fighter was rushed into production. Fortunately for the Allies, the FW-190 arrived after the close of the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1941, 5 Mark V Spitfires flying over the south coast spotted several radial engine fighters in German markings. At first glance, they were mistaken for US-built Republic Lancers. It was a deadly case of mistaken identity. The aircraft were, in reality, early model FW-190s. The Spitfire pilots who survived the ensuing battle lived to tell just how quickly their comrades had been lost. But Britain's greatest loss that day was not pilots or planes. The battle marked the day Britain lost air superiority to the Luftwaffe. The RAF had to do something, and fast. All eyes looked to Rolls-Royce, manufacturer of the Merlin engine, the power plant of the Spitfire, Hurricane, and so many of Britain's great planes. Although the company had the next-generation engine, the 12-cylinder Griffin, in development, it was well over a year away, more than enough time for Britain to lose the war. Earlier, there had been some thought given to modifying a few Merlin engines for experimental high-altitude work to be executed by a Wellington bomber. It was little more than an idea at the time, but in Britain's hour of desperate need, Rolls-Royce engineers worked night and day to test the concept. Merlin engines were already supercharged. An air compressor mechanically attached to the rotating camshaft increased the airflow to the engine, allowing it to burn more fuel and to boost performance. Rolls-Royce engineers had theorized that adding a second supercharger could give the engine even more punch during high-altitude work. Might a two-stage supercharger help the RAF reclaim air supremacy? The end result of the Rolls-Royce experiments was breathtaking. It was almost as if the two-stage, two-speed Merlin was an entirely different engine, when in fact it was just a modification. When the double supercharged aircraft, dubbed the Spitfire Mark IX, finally arrived in June of 1942, the RAF had a rare opportunity to test it directly against a captured FW-190. The test results were far different than the day a group of unlucky RAF pilots ran into a flock of butcherbirds. The two aircraft were virtual equals in terms of performance. Captain Eric Brown, who had flown a captured FW-190, had a chance to test the new Spitfire 9 against the German aircraft in live combat.
I'd flown the 190 quite a bit, so I wasn't too frightened. I reckoned I knew what that aircraft could do, and I knew what my Spit could do, so I thought, well, I can handle this guy. Hoping he was somebody just out of training school. But no, I picked somebody who really knew what he was up to. And we had, I would say, a to-ing and froing over France. But neither could get a draw bead on the other. We finally realized, as both of us, we run out of fuel. We waggled our wings at each other and departed. And I realized this was really a top-notch fighter aircraft.
The RAF had leveled the playing field with the Luftwaffe, at least for the time being. But what the RAF really needed was an aircraft to give them the upper hand. The new Merlin's greatest contribution to the war was still to come, when it was mated with an extraordinary aircraft of American design. Back in the U.S., North American Aircraft had continued to work on a Warhawk substitute, which met the specifications laid out by the British Purchasing Commission. They had specified that the airplane be powered by an Allison engine, that it cost less than $40,000, and that it be armed with 4 .303-inch machine guns. North American answered with the P-51 Mustang. It featured an advanced laminar flow wing for good aerodynamic efficiency and a wide gate undercarriage for safer landing. Pleasing to the eye and to fly, although mainly at lower altitudes, the new arrival quickly gained respect from pilots and ground crews alike. There were some concerns about how the Mustang would fare should it be forced to ditch while crossing the channel. During a water landing, its air scoop, located beneath the fuselage, might flood the aircraft or cause it to overturn. Water tank tests at Saunders Row were initiated to perfect the techniques for ditching the aircraft. Around the same time that the RAF was getting the Spitfire Mark IX ready for combat, and the FW-190 was dominating the skies, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Hawker was tasked with the mission of evaluating all aircraft powered by non-Rolls-Royce engines. He was thoroughly impressed with the P-51A, save for its poor performance at high altitude. Like the P-40 Warhawk, it had an Allison engine and no turbocharger. Hawker pondered how the aircraft might perform with the new Merlin engine. The results on paper were phenomenal. According to Rolls-Royce's calculations, with a Merlin power plant, the Mustang would not only outclass any American aircraft, but even new Spitfires using the same engine. Oddly, Hawker had to push for the mating of the Merlin 61 and the Mustang, even though the double supercharged P-51 would have outclassed the FW-190 as well. Hawker finally arranged for the marriage of the two great inventions, and test trials confirmed his hunch. The Mustang was a war winner. The main challenge was to produce enough aircraft and engines to reclaim the skies of Europe. North American would tweak the Mustang design to accommodate the Merlin 61 engine. It was a much more powerful engine, so the original P-51A airframe had to be reinforced. As well, the three-bladed prop was exchanged for one with four blades. The addition of plumbing for drop tanks might have seemed a small change, but it would have a great impact on the air battles to come. Packard took up manufacture of the Merlin 61 engines in the U.S. They were designated the V-1650s. Packard had arranged a licensing agreement with Rolls-Royce earlier in the war. Ford was originally slated to build American-made Merlins and seemed a perfect choice due to the company's industrial might. But Henry Ford was adamant that his company build defensive weapons only. North American's double supercharged aircraft, the P-51B and P-51C, first took flight in the spring and summer of 1943. Air Vice Marshal Paddy Harbison recalls when the Mustangs first arrived at his Spitfire squadron.
Well, of course, the Mustang was a revelation. It was a much more comfortable airplane than the Spitfire was. And I have heard people talk about the relative merits of both. They were both war winners. The Spitfire was built as an interceptor. It could outturn a Mustang and it could outclimb it, but it didn't have the legs the Mustang had. And of course, if you can't get to where the fight is, you're not too effective.
As P-51 started to arrive in Europe, the war was changing, and the Mustang was the perfect aircraft for the time. The U.S. was taking the war to Germany. They were bombing the German war industry out of business. The only problem was their bombers were being shredded by speedy German interceptors. The U.S. had hinged their hopes on the ability of their bombers to defend themselves by maintaining a tight box formation. When this strategy failed, they were in dire need of an escort fighter. The P-38 Lightning was simply not agile enough to take on the role. Then there was the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was an awesome radial engine fighter, more than capable of taking care of itself in battle. But it had two major flaws. It was expensive, and it lacked the range to take the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51Bs and Cs arrived just in time. They had been designed to carry drop tanks, and with the addition of a fuel tank behind the pilots, they had more than enough fuel to escort American bombers to Hitler's lair. The Mustang proved more than a match for Germany's FW-19 and ME-109. Slowly, American bombers closed in around Berlin. Suddenly, the Germans found themselves playing catch-up. Kurt Tank's FW-19 with a radial engine found it difficult at higher altitudes where the bombers roamed. Tank swapped its radial engine for an inline. The long-nosed aircraft was nicknamed the Dora.
The Focke-Wulf Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change, not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber.
The P-51 Mustang also continued to evolve as mechanics and engineers incorporated changes based on the feedback of pilots who had tested the plane in battle. Its canopy went through several permutations. The British swapped the original one for a sliding Malcolm hood, similar to a Spitfire's for improved visibility. The P-51B, the definitive version of the Mustang, had a bubble canopy, which offered 360 degrees of clear view. North American also upgraded the D's firepower. It had 650 caliber machine guns compared to 4 in earlier models, and it had solved the problem of gun jamming during hard turns. The fuel tank situated behind the pilot may have increased range, but it created other issues. The plane had poor directional stability when the tank was full. To counter this problem, engineers added a small dorsal fin in the D model. These and other improvements would help the Mustang blaze a path to Berlin for America's bombers. Reichsmarschal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." When the European war had come to a close, the battle still raged in the Pacific. The Mustang was the best escort available, but even with its incredible range, it could not accompany an aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress on extended bombing missions over Japan. The expanses of ocean were too large. The engineers at North American struggled with the problem of stretching the Mustang's range. Their solution was a Zwilling, or twin Mustang. By fusing two Mustangs together, they hoped to dramatically increase the range of the Mustang while retaining its excellent dogfighting abilities. The new Mustang, the F-82, had an incredible range, 2,000 miles. Though the prototypes were powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, the U.S. Army Air Corps was adamant that the production version be totally American-made. Unfortunately for the F-82, without Merlin engines, it was not the same aircraft. When fitted with the Allison V-1710-100, its speed dropped and high-altitude performance suffered. It was one of the few cases of a prototype outperforming the production model of an aircraft. By the time the F-82 was ready, Japan had surrendered, and the war was over. After the war, the P-51 continued to serve, while other piston engine fighters of the era went quietly into retirement. Though it was the dawn of the jet age, there was still a place for the Mustang in a variety of roles. Colonel Ray O. Roberts flew the Mustang during its second life.
At that time I was flying what they call the F6, which is a P-51 with cameras, also had guns, and you could have the bombing and gunnery capability. And we participated in a post-hostilities mapping program. We mapped, revised all the Japanese maps, photographed, did aerial photography in Japan and Korea.
When the Korean War arrived, Mustangs which had been mothballed for long-term storage were suddenly being shipped across the Pacific on carriers. Unable to compete with the next generation of jet fighters for the dogfighter role, Mustangs returned to where they started. In Korea, Mustangs made excellent ground attack aircraft. They didn't have the speed of jets, but they had the endurance to make it from Japan to Korea on bombing runs. In Korea, the F-82 also had an opportunity to taste combat for the first time. F-82s flew strike, escort, and night fighter missions. The marriage of the P-51 Mustang and the Merlin 61 engine produced incredible results. It provided the Allies with an effective escort to pound the last nails into Germany's coffin. Perhaps the most amazing thing about the P-51's stellar career is that it might never have happened. If the Merlin and Mustang had never been mated at the suggestion of Hawker at Rolls-Royce, the P-51 might have had a humdrum career as a reliable ground attack aircraft, rather than an elite dogfighter. It arrived at the right time and the right place in history, just when the Allies needed an escort fighter. The P-51 was the end result of years of aircraft and engine development. Though jet-powered aircraft would supplant it, the impact of the Mustang and Merlin in military history cannot be unwritten or denied.
Of the three great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Ju-88, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the ME262 were the three. The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. The Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190 PA4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Heinkel 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up to the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication. And also, there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They learned to put the 4 crew of the Ju-88 into one glass house, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188. The 188 had a rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better. And I was very impressed with both types of aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, as a fighter, was first class. There's no question of that. It was an outstanding airplane. And inevitably, as the war progressed, there were attempts made to keep up with the hunt, so to speak, and give it a variety of roles. And there were many different marks of 190, and it eventually gravitated into the fighter bomber. In that role, it was quite effective, actually. Fighter bombers have a limited role. They are used against what I call targets of opportunity. You don't use them to come in and bomb an industrial layout. What you do is you use them to shoot up trains or convoys you see on the road. And from this way, the Focke-Wulf 190 was very effective again. So it was a versatile aircraft. And as it progressed, it eventually had an engine change. The Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change and not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber. Now the ME262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II. When you consider that at the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When we tested the Messerschmitt 262, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. This was a quantum jump in performance, and it meant the 262 was virtually inviolate. It also handled quite well in the air. It had no nasty characteristics really, except if you lost an engine on takeoff before you reached safety speed. But apart from that, I was very impressed. It had two shortcomings, but all the early jets did in our country, in America and in Germany. Firstly, the engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, we hadn't thought, or the designers hadn't thought, of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this and the few 262s we picked off was usually in that phase of the operation.
After the invasion, it was before the fall of Paris. Anyway, we were escorting bombers. As soon as we have enough of the enemy planes leave, that the bombers are not in any additional danger, we could choose to chase one of the enemy planes down when they were going away from the fight. So we fought from 30,000 to about 5,000, doing every kind of maneuver you could think of, trying to trick the other one. But I finally got some hits on his engine. Well, that started smoking. Made him nervous. So he said, well, I'm going to fly over Paris. I got thousands of gunners in Paris that could all shoot at him. They gave me a better chance to be clear of it. Well, I followed him right on in over Paris. And he was getting even more nervous. So he chose the route to fly under the Eiffel Tower. And I was hot on his tail. I was, he came through, I came right through. But when he had to pull up, you don't have a choice of going anywhere except straight ahead at first until you get some altitude. So he was sitting right in my gun sight. What finished him off there as he pulled out of the trip under the Eiffel Tower. And funny thing about it, years later, I'm still running into people, some Parisians, some people who just happened to be in Paris during the occupation. And they say, we celebrated for 3 days because you got that trick in. So I thought that was pretty nice to have it confirmed by the viewers and so forth, the people who saw the event. I didn't report it. When we got over there in the situation with the PR people and everything, and we also found out that some of the pilots claimed some doubtful claims and having their wingmen swear to it and so forth. I decided I wasn't get into that, so I never put any claim of any kind. But the other fellows, I had to tell it, but not to the officials. We were assigned the Russian shuttle mission. We were to Russia, 5 missions out of Russia, out of Italy from Russia, 5 missions out of Italy. The Spitfires and P-39s missions were limited by their fuel capacity to 2-hour missions. And when we were assigned to go to Russia and Italy, they sent over a Australian who had flown with the RAF 2 tours, no mission over 2 hours. Well, he was on my wing, his first mission that was going to exceed 2 hours. It actually was 8 hours by the time we landed in a grass field in Russia. He did lose enthusiasm rather rapidly, and the hours piled up. But we had a lot of fun. Russia was very unfriendly. They had some tents set up with holding bunks. Signed to and told me where I was supposed to sleep. I see some P-39 sitting over there on the same field that we landed. I started over to them, and the Russian guards, "Stop!" Made it clear they wanted me to stop. So I stopped, but here I was, American pilot with hundreds of hours in a P-39, more than they had. They hadn't been sending them to them very long. And they did something to increase the altitude. P-39 was sluggish at altitude. The way we had it was not supercharged. So maybe they supercharged it and got good flight characteristics at altitude. Well, one interesting thing that happened on that shuttle mission, we stayed there a while and flew missions out of Russia back to Germany and on. Then we ran into some beet vodka. Now, I was familiar with potato vodka. I never run into beet vodka before. I thought it would be real nice to bring some along and share with my buddies. So I eliminated ammunition and put in beet vodka. So I was leading. I was as safe as I could be. I didn't eat anything. We got over Palesti on the way to Italy. Ran into a bunch of German 109s. But they took off and ran. They didn't want to dabble with us at all. They just leave and go. The last one that was running away rolled over, bailed out. He may have had engine trouble or nerve trouble, or I don't know what happened to him, but he rolled over and bailed out. And of course, the officials rule at the closest plane too. So in a situation like this, I was leading the flight. I was the closest one to him. But I could never claim one that had no ammunition except beet vodka. So that was not exactly the time for the claiming planes down.
We're dusting off a real gem from the vaults. A film that's more than just a movie. It's a piece of American history. Filmed in stunning color, when most of what we saw from the war was in black and white. We're talking about the 1947 classic, Thunderbolt. Now, this isn't your typical Hollywood war picture. This is the real deal. Filmed in 1944 over the battlefields of Italy, this documentary puts you right in the cockpit of the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt. Lovingly nicknamed the Jug by its pilots, this was the beast that cleared the skies and pounded enemy supply lines. What makes this film truly special is who was behind the camera. Legendary director William Wyler, the man who gave us classics like Ben-Hur, put his Hollywood career on hold to serve his country. He and his crew flew right alongside the 57th Fighter Group, capturing breathtaking and dangerous combat footage. And here's a fascinating fact for you. Wyler was so dedicated to getting the perfect shot that he suffered permanent hearing loss from the roar of the engines in the unpressurized planes. That's commitment. The film even has an introduction by another American icon who served, Jimmy Stewart. Thunderbolt is a powerful first-hand look at the courage and skill of our flyboys in World War II. It's a story of men and their incredible machines, told by the people who were actually there. So get comfortable as we take you back to the skies of 1944.
This picture was photographed in combat zones by cameramen of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces and by pilots of the 12th Air Force, who, during missions against the enemy, operated automatic cameras in their planes. Behind the pilot, shooting forward and back. Under the wing. In the wing, timed with the guns. In the wheel well. In the instrument panel, photographing the pilot himself.
The commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, General Carl Spaatz, has asked me to tell you something about this picture. I don't think I could do any better than just to read from his telegram to me. Thunderbolt was made in 1944, ancient history. It was made about one fighter-bomber group in the Italian campaign. It happens to be an American group. But the same story could well be told of the Royal Air Force groups which participated so gallantly in the same air offensive. As a matter of fact, the story belongs to all men who fought for freedom and did it a long way from home. Signed, Spaatz. Thank you.
To the Italian man in the street, or what's left of the street, this is the fulfillment of a promise. The promise of the fascists to build a 20th century Roman Empire, conceived in tyranny and dedicated to the proposition that some men were meant to be slaves of other men. Special victims were the children. They saw things not meant for children's eyes. From the air, Italy is more remote. The airman never sees the face of the people, only the face of the country. From the air, you look down at the mountains. Look down and wonder how our men on the ground ever got through. Mountains and rivers. The Volturno, a lot of American blood in that one. Natural barriers made other campaigns tough too. Exhausted Hannibal's elephants, Caesar's legions. For the airmen, the ground war is remote. The only war you really understand is the air war. You can see a pattern to it. Lots of the country never been touched. Little towns that walk the ridges, like tightrope artists to keep from falling off. This one didn't matter. When something did matter, that was another story. This is how we changed the face of Italy from the air. They boasted Italian trains ran on time. Not these. This is what we did to the face of Italy. There's a story behind why we did it and how we did it. The story starts on an island, 60 miles off Italy's coast. The island of Corsica.
Corsica. Rugged. Primitive. Mountainous. Malarial. Here they still remember a local boy who put Corsica on the map 150 years ago. This island part of France was liberated by the French in September 43, but you can still find a few Germans left by the wayside where they fell, in the shadow of our aerodromes. Alto Air Base, Sunday morning. Here, Sunday is like Monday, and Monday is like every other day in the week, a working day. The engines wake you at dawn. In your sack, you can hear the crew chiefs pre-flighting your planes. getting them ready for the day's missions. This is how you live when you're an airplane driver, fighting an air war, 20 minutes from the Germans in Italy. You're used to it. You've been washing out of your helmet since July 42. From the Holy Land to Africa, across the desert, Egypt and El Alamein, to Libya and Tunisia. 1,300 miles. You moved when the infantry moved. Sicily and Italy. 58 moves in 2 years. Now Corsica. This is the best deal you ever had. Call it the country club. When you talk about air power, this is what you mean. You mean Spanky Manda. Major Francis S. Manda of Metmore, New Mexico. Squadron operations officer. Not a desk job. Had over 170 missions, working for 200. He's 22. You mean Captain Howard Hickok of Ames, Iowa. He's a flight leader. Just had 30 days in the States. Time to get married and come back. He's 23. Or, in his Italian general's trailer, Gil Wyman, Louisville, Kentucky. Hardly looks old enough to vote, but he's boss of a squadron. He signs his letters, Gilbert O. Wyman, Lieutenant Colonel, Air Corps, commanding. The old man. He's 24. Sunday morning, for the 57th Fighter Group, 3 squadrons, 1,000 men. Another day begins at Alto Air Base. You could close your eyes and see it this way, spread out like a diagram. Been home sweet home for some time. Good steel mat runway, 150 by 6,000 feet. Tower call sign is Breakneck. Lots of jokes about that. We share the field with a French fighter group. Don't speak the same language, but we fly the same airplane against the same enemy. Each lost a man yesterday. We get along. Group commander, Lieutenant Colonel Archie J. Knight, West Point, 1940. He's 27. First mission today is a 6-5 squadron show. Briefing, right after breakfast. Informal, short, to the point. Park yourself on a bomb crate and get your escape kit. Enemy money. Instructions to get you back through the lines, just in case. The S2 tells you about your target. He doesn't have to draw it for you. You do this every day. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Gil Wyman will lead the show. So he lays out the job. That's a nurse's hat. It's girls. Wears it for luck. Eat all you can get. The brass upstairs plans the war. They want something done, they pick up the phone. You do it. Don't always know why they send you out on a mission. Don't always care. But you know there's a reason. A good one.
Today, the missions are going out because in Italy our armies have been stopped, cold, at the Gustav Line, across the narrowest and most mountainous part of the peninsula. U.S. 5th Army, British 8th Army, stopped for 5 months. At Anzio, 100,000 men sweating it out. We couldn't move. Stalemate. March 15th, we bombed Cassino, our immediate objective. Good job of bombing. Didn't work. Our infantry didn't advance. It was the wrong use of air power. Wrong because we were not taking advantage of the airplane's greatest asset, its ability to get behind the enemy. That's what the air planners wanted to do, get behind him. Lieutenant General Ira C. Aker, commanding all the air in the Mediterranean, British, French, and American. Major General John K. Cannon, Uncle Joe, commanding the 12th Air Force. and Brigadier General Gordon P. Seville, 12th Tactical Air Command, the brass upstairs who run the air war. They said, let's not hit him here. Let's hit him here. Let's isolate the battlefield. Let's weaken the entire German front by depriving it of supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, reinforcements. They call the plan Operation Strangle. This is what we want to do with airplanes. How? A lot of railroads in Italy. This is the enemy. Keep the trains from getting through. A lot of rivers in Italy, and over 700 major bridges. We figured if a train came to one, and it wasn't there, it'd be kind of tough to get across. Medium bombers got many of the important ones, but bridges are long, narrow targets, difficult to hit and destroy. Took a lot of trips, bombs, planes, men. We started to use a special weapon.
A fighter bomber, the P-47 Thunderbolt. One engine, one man, one bomb on each wing, extra fuel tanks for range. 6-5's crew chiefs taxi from the dispersal points to the end of the runway. Line up the squadron. All the pilots have to do is climb in and take them away. If you're a crew chief, you've got your own P-47. Sometimes you think of it as your personal airplane. The pilot's a fella you lend it to every day. You let him fly around in it, and you expect him to bring it back in good condition. No bullet holes or flak holes. After you've been lending your airplane to one pilot for a long time, you get attached to him, too. If you're a pilot, no matter what your rank or how many hours you've had, what counts here is the combat flying you've done. Unless you've done plenty, you're a beginner. You're called a sprog. And you remain a sprog until you're wise to the tricks of the trade. After you put a few missions behind you, you become a sport. Then, with plenty of action, 50 or 60 missions, if you're still around, you're promoted. You become an old sport, a veteran. The big shots, like Gil Wyman, are called wheels. No one knows exactly why. This fella's a wheel, too. Says so in his plane. Major Richard O. Hunziker of Tucson, Arizona. Got 179 missions. Your crew chief can't go along, so you always like to tell him what you're going to do. Got a triple threat mission today. Each section's going after a bridge. I'll come in on a course of about 40 degrees. Same old thing. Go out there and dodge around in the ack-ack. Dive bomb out of a left-hand turnabout and carry the bombs right on down. We're flying top cover on the other two sections while they bomb, and then we go in ourselves. Weather's supposed to be Cavu, so maybe we'll have a good show. All set to go. But you don't. You wait. You wait for 5 minutes. That's the way it's planned. Time to settle down. Relax. You'll be busy later. So if you've got any thinking to do, and who hasn't, now's the time to do it. Here, roll this till I get back. Takeoff is always rough. Thunderbolt's a heavy airplane. Besides, you've decorated it like a Christmas tree. Belly tank, rockets, guns, 500-pound bombs, cameras.
Hello, Breakneck. Cola Leader here. We're clear to take the runway for a takeoff. Over.
Roger, Cola Leader from Breakneck. You're clear number 1 to take off.
Roger, Breakneck. Thank you.
The mile of steel runway will shrink to nothing under you. Halfway down, by the tower, you'll be committed. That means you can't slam on the brakes and stop. Once you're committed, you usually go up. First pair, Wyman and Gustafsson. First pair off. Second pair taxis out. Goss and Burgess. Made it okay. Manda and Richardson. Smith and Atwood. Come on, get her up. Hickok and Morrow. Last pair, Welby's and Hunziker. The squadron is airborne. Over Corsica, then out to sea, on the deck. "60 miles east to Italy. Flying from Corsica, you go only 60 miles, and you're 150 miles behind the German front. Turn again on that castle. Now you're heading north, into the mountains. Leader section, red section, black section. Formation flying, a game of follow the leader, the squadron leader. He navigates, makes the decisions. Doesn't tell you what to do, does it? You follow, wingtip to wingtip. He turns, you turn. He climbs, you climb. Climbing still to 10,000 through the clouds. Getting close. close. Start looking for the target. Stuck down there in one of those ravines. All look alike. Wingman, he's back. Keep the formation spread out. There's a checkpoint. That road. Follow it down to the river. Your first bridge should be down there. Somewhere. There it is. Pass over. Come back and attack from the opposite direction. One of the tricks you've learned. Leader section. Goes into loose string formation. One plane behind the other. Then, Wyman peels off. The rest of the section follows. At 2-second intervals. Last man goes in. No bomb sight in the P-47. Pilot does his own aiming. Bomb bursts from the planes ahead. Couple of misses. Direct hit. I hope your aim is good. Drop your bombs. Pull out. They black you out for a second. Blood drains from your head. But you're young. It comes back fast. You're all right now. Leader section reforms. Top cover. Watch his red section bomb. A miss. Another miss. A hit. Black section goes down. Straddle the target. Concussion should do the trick. No more bombs. Still got plenty of gas. Plenty of ammo. Go on the prowl. Ease down on the deck. See what you can find. Railroad tracks. Following tracks. Not a bad way to find a train. You spot one. Kick her over. Give it a few squirts. Might kill somebody. Bust the locomotive first. Train can't move now. Let's see what's in those boxcars. 12 of you. You'll all crisscross in. Everybody takes a few passes. Try the cars one at a time. Might be something interesting in them. It usually is. Got it burning nicely now. Take another pass. Pull up. Strafing spreads the squadron over the sky. Every man his own general. Looks like we're out of trains. Lighthouse out there. Wonder if I've got any ammo left. Yep. Radio station. Blow out a few tubes. Somebody in that field. Don't know who they are. No friends of mine. Military vehicles parked in that farmyard. More in back. Must be a headquarters. Houses around here look kind of suspicious. Might be something in them. Nothing in that one. Nothing in that one. Could be wrong. Nothing in that one. What do you know? Back at Alto. No one is sweating out 6-5 squadron. 6-6 is taking off. No one will sweat them out either. There are too many missions. 9 for today. When you don't fly, you've got things to do. Try to make some sort of life for yourself. In trying, you've improvised an American community. Step off the field, you're in Corsica. Step back on, you're in America. This is part of the war, too. The endless detail of living. The dust is a problem. Dust is good for the laundry business. Hand laundry. Branches everywhere. Community laundry. 3-day service. And for the rugged individualist, water supply, pump, heating unit, washing machine. The sergeant used to sell these in New Orleans. He's keeping his hand in. The barber shop. And for the next customer, always something to read. Never more than a year old. Bus line. Lunchtime special. And for the intellectually minded, there's time for the more serious things like practicing your yo-yo. If there's anything you want, don't ask for it. Build it. Build as though you'd be here forever, knowing you may get orders to move tomorrow. 6-6 found this canyon, made it their living area. Nobody said they couldn't. Nobody says you can't have a house. Build it. Nobody says your squadron can't have a beach club. Build one. Nobody says you can't dam up a river to make a swimming hole. This American community has everything. When you come off your shift and somebody else is carrying the ball, you try to relax, enjoy yourself. In danger a couple hours a day, the rest of the time, you're out of it. Beach club's a busy place. So is the Mediterranean. Mussolini once called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. But that was yesterday. The yachtsman. An old wing tank and a few odds and ends make quite a boat. The crew chief scrounge parts. Scrounge is polite for steel. Scrounge him from wrecked Jerry planes, banged up Italian cars, old parachutes for sails. They use only the best quality junk. Sometimes when you can get a PX ration of beer, you drink it. Then you look like this. Alto's the best deal you ever had. The country club. Lot of laugh, lot of sun. Your American community has everything, except the things you really want. There are times you'd rather be flying than waiting around, killing time. Because when you're flying, you don't have that feeling of the day, the week, and month slipping by and leaving you standing still. These are your years to get started, find yourself, your job, profession, get married, kids, home of your own. These are the years that count. So, you have your pets, to give and receive affection. In return for affection, sea rations, book broth. As always in affairs of the heart, some have peculiar tastes. Six Squadron, heading out. 6-5 Squadron, heading home. A meeting in the air comes and goes fast. .65, feeder section. One plane light. When you reformed after strafing, you noticed it. Nobody saw it happen. Maybe spun in, maybe bailed out. You'll think about it later. Now you're waiting for that first sight of home. That's Sarago Air Base. That's Bavenko. You're on your own street. Alto's first turn to the left, 3 fields down. Keep the formation tight. When you fly over those other outfits, you want to look good. Show them how it's done. Alto, home. You come in low and peel up. You peel up to reduce speed. Space the planes 20 seconds apart for landing. Second and third flights go on past the field. They'll circle back when the first flight is down. Drop your gear. Second flight peels up. Third flight will circle again. This is all the flying the ground crews see. You like to give them a kick. Sometimes you're tired. Land them rough. It's embarrassing. The colonel's not happy about the flak holes. New airplane. His crew chief will be mighty sore. And how will you explain this away? Then, after the interrogation, you relax. Grab off some donuts and coffee. Jive with a Red Cross girl who meets every mission. And fly the show all over again, on the ground. Wyman goes back to work, at being a colonel. Missing an action report to sign. A telegram from the War Department has to start somewhere.
By mid-April, every rail line in Italy was blocked. We drew a line of interdiction across the country. No train could move south of it. South of it, the railroad system was dead. But the German had to keep the supplies moving, still had highways. He took to the roads, So we took to the roads. This is what the Germans fear most. You don't blame them. This is the way Rommel got it. He isn't the only one. When you clobber a highway, you burn plenty of ammo. Cyclic rate of fire, 800 rounds a minute. You've got 8 guns, 106 bullets a second. Rockets. Those aren't just trucks and Germans. You're stopping ammunition before it's fired on the Fifth Army front. And you're doing it 200 miles behind that front. In the weeks that followed, from Corsica to Italy was like a trip to the corner drugstore. You could do it in your sleep.
We averaged 8 and 9 missions a day at the 57th. The French flew about as many. Lafayette Escadrille, the 324th, the 86th over in Italy, the 79th next door. It was good to look up and watch them go by. But there were other things. There were those pillars of smoke. Never knew when you'd see one. That's a wreck. A P-47's cooking, and there's a man in it. When they hit like this, there's nothing to do. Let them burn, and stay clear of the exploding ammo. Keep on landing. You have to. No place to park up there. Why did it happen? Engine cut out for a second. 200 yards from the runway. 200 yards from home. Flak damage might have caused it. You'll never know for sure. All you know is the sum. The war is expensive. You wish the people back home could at least see it.
We kept up the pressure. And by the beginning of May, the roads were practically closed. If one man on a motorcycle appeared on the highway by day, he was a dead pigeon. The German took to the sea. 2 months after we started, the strangle was on. The Germans had barely enough supplies for 2 weeks. That's when our ground forces attacked. Allied troops took Cassino. We linked up with a beachhead at Anzio, and in 3 weeks, we're in Rome. The men on the ground pushed north, and as they moved up, they saw what had been done to help them. 10,000 enemy vehicles, destroyed or damaged. In every town they took, no marshalling yard. How many German tanks went out of business because of the gasoline these trains never carried? They advanced, and they saw the bridges. How many German shells were never fired because they couldn't get across the rivers? The ground forces exploited their breakthrough. In plain language, they shot and killed Germans. And they ate up the country. Almost 250 miles in one non-stop offensive.
The ground forces won a battle, but they still had a war to fight, and you were still flying missions. Up from first light to last light. Only the coming of darkness would stop you. Slowly the coming of darkness would bring the last missions home to Alto. Then the long work day would end. Some men hit the sack early, and some spent another quiet evening at the club, Colonel Wyman's Country Club, for airplane drivers.
Everybody have a good time, stay in bed till half past time. Sit around at the pub, Colonel Wyman Country Club. Yeah, you let me around till Colonel Wyman, yeah.